Why did the valley feel wrong even before the first shot was fired? Alexis Brennan lay pressed into the cold stone of the western ridge, her body unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of her breath. 6 hours. That's how long she'd been there. 6 hours of silence so complete it felt like the mountains were holding their breath with her. The rifle beneath her cheek was familiar, comforting, almost alive. She trusted it more than she trusted voices in her ear. Down below, 12 rangers moved through Coringal Valley, unaware they were walking into a shape she recognized too well. A shape carved from memory, from loss. Her earpiece crackled, calm, dismissive, the sound of authority that never bothered to look twice. Sector 7, low priority, the quiet roots. Again. Alexis acknowledged the order without protest because protesting had never changed anything. Being unseen was something she'd learned to live with, being unheard hurt more. She scanned the ridge line slowly, methodically. The way her father had taught her, don't rush. Quiet places don't stay quiet forever. She saw movement, purposeful, wrong, not goats, not herders. Her chest tightened as the pattern formed piece by piece like a terrible equation she already knew the answer to. She reported it once, then again and again. Each time she was told the same thing: locals, false positives, focus on your sector. She stayed focused. That was the problem. As the ambush assembled itself with horrifying precision, Alexis felt doubt creep in, not about what she was seeing, but about herself. Was she wrong? Was this her imagination filling the silence with ghosts? That doubt had been planted carefully over months. Quiet assignments, empty reports, no shots fired, no proof she belonged. She thought of her father then. Of the report she'd memorized as a child. 3 sides, high ground, heavy weapons, men walking into a place they wouldn't walk out of. She saw the machine gun come together through her scope. Her finger hovered near the trigger. Not yet. Below, the rangers kept moving. What do you do when the truth is clear, but permission never comes? The first burst of gunfire tore the valley open like a scream. Alexis didn't hear it, she saw it. The muzzle flashes blooming like violent flowers along the ridge lines. She saw bodies fall. She saw men scatter for cover that didn't exist. She saw history repeat itself in real time. The exact shape, the same geometry, the same silence from command. Her radio stayed quiet. That was the moment everything narrowed. Not to anger, not to fear, to clarity. She turned the radio off. The world became math and breath and weight. She found the first target, steady hands betraying none of the storm inside her. She squeezed, the recoil was familiar. Grounding. The gunner folded, then another, each shot deliberate, controlled, not rushed. She wasn't angry, she wasn't heroic, she was present. Below, the rangers felt the shift before they understood it. Fire slowed, then stopped. The unseen hand pulling death away from them one shot at a time. They didn't know where it was coming from, only that it was precise, relentless, protective. Alexis moved through targets with the discipline of years and the weight of inheritance. Wind, distance, breath, squeeze. She did not celebrate the hits. She marked them and moved on. There was no room for anything else. 19 rounds. 14 lives ended. 10 saved. By the time the helicopters arrived, the ambush was already dead. She stayed where she was until the last threat disappeared. Then she sat back, suddenly aware of how tired she was, not physically, spiritually. The cost of the decision settled in. Her career was over, she knew that. She accepted it. Below, men lived. That would have to be enough. What does survival feel like when it comes from someone you'll never see? Staff Sergeant Kane had already decided he was dead when the machine gun fell silent. He'd made peace with it in that quiet way soldiers do. Thought of his daughter, his wife, the unfinished things. Then the shooting stopped. Not faded, stopped. One by one, the hills went quiet. The kind of quiet that follows intention, not exhaustion. Kane scanned the ridges, searching for the impossible. There was no support where there should have been. No air. no Overwatch angle that made sense, and yet something had intervened. Someone had. Back at base, Alexis turned in her rifle without ceremony. No one met her eyes. She was confined to quarters, investigated, her name erased from the initial reports. The system moved quickly when it needed to protect itself. But silence doesn't last forever. Someone had recorded everything. Someone else remembered patterns. And someone had finally decided not to stay quiet. The truth came out slowly, painfully, through transcripts and testimony and men who stood up and said, "She saved us," over and over, a chorus that grew too loud to ignore. Briggs said nothing at first, then everything. He spoke of Desert Storm, of a sniper who stayed behind so he could live, of guilt that hardened into control, of protection that became prejudice, of fear wearing the uniform of authority. Alexis listened without interrupting. She didn't need an apology. She needed the truth acknowledged. The charges were dismissed. The commendation followed. But those weren't the things that mattered most. Later, alone again, Alexis stood on a different ridge, a different valley, somewhere quieter. She held the photograph in her hands, father and survivor, past and present. She thought about the cost of silence, about how many lives depend on people being willing to speak and act when it matters. She exhaled. Somewhere 10 families slept peacefully, never knowing her name. And that was enough. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. What does it feel like to be trusted with lives, yet never trusted with your voice? Alexis Brennan had learned the sound of being dismissed long before she learned the sound of incoming fire. It wasn't loud. It didn't bark orders or slam doors. It came softly, wrapped in professionalism, delivered through radios and briefings with practiced calm. Low priority, quiet sector, maintain observation. Words that sounded reasonable. Words that slowly hollowed a person out. She lay on the western ridge, the cold stone pressing through layers of camouflage, and wondered again what she had done wrong. Not in this moment, but over the past 3 months, since arriving at the team, since walking into the briefing room with her orders and watching something in Senior Chief Briggs' face change the instant he read her name. She replayed that look 100 times. Recognition, pain, fear, something unfinished. She hadn't known then that her last name carried a weight older than she was. The wind slid across the ridge, tugging at loose fabric, whispering through rock and scrub. Alexis adjusted her position by centimeters, mindful not to silhouette herself. Down in the valley, the rangers moved steadily, boots crunching softly against gravel. They trusted the hills, trusted the unseen eyes meant to protect them. That trust sat heavy in her chest. Her scope drifted across the eastern ridge again. The shapes were still there, clearer now, deliberate, too deliberate. She slowed her breathing, fighting the familiar internal argument. Don't overthink. Don't imagine threats where none exist. That was the voice she'd learned to internalize. The voice of caution turned inward. The voice that said, maybe you're not as good as you think. She keyed the radio once more. Calm, professional. No emotion allowed to leak through. She described what she saw with precision, careful not to sound alarmist. She waited. The response came quickly, too quickly. Dismissed. Her jaw tightened, though her voice didn't change when she acknowledged. She stayed on the scope, stayed with the shapes, watched them unpack equipment with the efficiency of men who had rehearsed this moment. Her heart rate ticked up, not from fear but from recognition. Patterns mattered, and this pattern was screaming. Her mind slipped backward without permission. She was 4 years old when the Navy chaplain knocked on the door. Too young to understand words like killed in action, but old enough to recognize the sound her mother made when the world collapsed. She remembered the uniform, the folded flag, the way adults spoke in careful tones as if volume alone could shatter her. Later came the reports, the language of war stripped of poetry. Ambush, enemy fire, stayed behind, bought time, her father's name printed in neat official font. Colonel Nathan Brennan, Sniper, protector, dead. Alexis had grown up with that story like a second skeleton beneath her skin. Some kids rebelled against legacies like that. She leaned into it, not because she wanted to die the way he did, but because she wanted to understand the choice, the moment. What made someone decide that strangers were worth more than their own survival? That question had followed her into training, into the Navy, into sniper school where instructors pushed until bones ached and doubt screamed louder than gunfire. She endured it all quietly, excelled, learned that precision wasn't just mechanical, it was emotional, the ability to act cleanly even when your hands shook. By the time she joined the team, she'd already proven herself on paper. Confirmed kills, commendations, evaluations that described her as disciplined, calm, exceptionally reliable under pressure. None of it seemed to matter here. Mission after mission, she'd been placed on the edges, rear security, secondary approaches, the nothing sectors. At first, she told herself it was coincidence. Then she wondered if it was caution. Then, finally, she began to fear it was judgment. Maybe she wasn't trusted. Maybe she didn't belong. That doubt gnawed at her during long nights and longer silences. It made her hesitate now, watching the ambush take shape. It made her question her instincts even as they sharpened. Through the scope, she saw the machine gun come together piece by piece. The unmistakable profile, the angle it would fire, the lane of death it would carve through the valley floor. Her chest tightened painfully. She reported again. The response was colder this time, sharper, a warning disguised as authority. Focus on your sector, stop clogging comms. The implication was clear, you're imagining things, you're the problem. She swallowed the response, burning her tongue. Arguing would only reinforce the narrative she'd been fighting since day one. Emotional, difficult, unreliable. So she stayed quiet. But she watched. She counted. She mapped the positions in her mind, building the kill zone the way she'd been trained to dismantle one. 3 sides, overlapping fire, rockets placed for vehicles that weren't even there yet. It was textbook, brutal, efficient. Below, the Rangers walked into it. Alexis felt something inside her fracture, not break but split cleanly down the center. On one side was obedience, career, everything she'd worked for since she was old enough to understand what her father had done. On the other side was certainty, not belief, not suspicion, knowing. She thought of the photograph tucked into her pocket, the one slipped under her door the night before, 2 men in a desert, one holding a rifle with easy familiarity, the other younger, smiling. Warren Briggs, her father. Saved my life, the note on the back had said. She hadn't slept much after finding it. The contradiction had kept her awake. If Briggs owed her father everything, why did it feel like he was trying to erase her? Why did his protection feel like a cage? The first burst of gunfire answered that question with violence. The valley erupted, noise, chaos, men shouting. The clean geometry she'd seen through her scope exploded into blood and panic. Alexis felt the impact in her bones, even from this distance. She saw one ranger spin and fall. Another dragged toward non-existent cover. She saw rockets streak down, exploding dirt and stone where human bodies had been seconds earlier. Her radio came alive with frantic voices, calls for support, requests for permission, panic breaking through discipline. Then calm again. Hold position. That was when her doubt evaporated. The choice clarified itself with terrifying simplicity. She could obey and watch men die, or she could act and destroy her future. There was no version of this moment where she walked away clean. Her father's voice surfaced then, not as sound but as memory. A line from a letter she'd found years after his death. When you see the shot, you take it. Politics don't matter when lives are on the line. Her hand stopped shaking. She reached up and switched off the radio. The silence that followed was absolute. No orders, no permission, no safety net. Just her. She settled in behind the rifle, the familiar weight grounding her. Breath in, breath out. Numbers ran cleanly through her mind. Wind, distance, elevation. The machine gunner filled her scope, unaware that death had already decided on him. Alexis felt no anger toward him, no hatred, just resolve. Her finger moved to the trigger. 2 pounds of pressure. That was all it took to end one life and save many others. As she found the natural pause in her breathing, she whispered words meant for no one else. Not a prayer, not an apology. Just a promise. I won't let it happen again. And she squeezed. How do you stay human when the world reduces itself to targets and time? The first shot did not sound heroic. It sounded final. Alexis felt the recoil travel cleanly into her shoulder, a familiar pressure that grounded her even as everything else fell away. Through the scope, she saw the machine gunner collapse forward, his body folding into the weapon he'd been moments from unleashing on the valley below. The kill zone lost its teeth in an instant. One angle gone, one future erased. She didn't allow herself to linger. Training took over, not the loud kind, not the shouted commands and stopwatch drills, but the quiet discipline that lived in muscle memory. Bolt, exhale, reacquire. The assistant gunner was turning, confusion spreading across his heat signature like a question he would never finish asking. The second round answered it. 2 shots, 2 bodies, a machine gun that would never speak. Down in the valley, the Rangers felt it before they understood it. The heavy chatter that had pinned them to the dirt vanished mid-burst, replaced by an abrupt, blessed silence from one direction. Staff Sergeant Kane lifted his head just enough to register the change. Not hope yet, just surprise. Alexis shifted her scope north. She could see the rocket team now, 2 men, one loading, one aiming. They worked with calm efficiency, unaware they were already late. She adjusted for distance, for the slight rise in wind as the sun crept higher. Her breathing slowed further, each inhale measured, each exhale deliberate. This was the state she'd learned to trust, the place beyond doubt. The loader fell first, spine shattered, the rocket slipping uselessly from his hands. The gunner hesitated, just long enough to look up, just long enough to realize something was wrong. He ran. Alexis led him by instinct and calculation combined. The bullet caught him mid-stride. Momentum carried his body forward even after life had left it, a reminder that physics didn't care about intention. 4 shots. She didn't count aloud, she didn't need to. The ambush began to unravel. What had been a coordinated trap dissolved into confusion as fighters realized death was coming from an angle they hadn't planned for. Shouts carried faintly up the valley. Hands waved. Orders contradicted each other. Alexis found the man doing the signaling, clearly in charge, clearly trying to regain control. The range was long, longer than she preferred. She took the extra second to calculate. Her father's voice again, calm and precise, reminding her that haste ruined more shots than fear ever did. She squeezed. The round took its time crossing the distance. She watched it land, watched the commander drop, watched the structure of the ambush collapse with him. Below, Kane felt the shift as clearly as a change in weather. Incoming fire slackened. Rockets stopped. The chaos above them wasn't random anymore, it was panicked. He shouted orders, voice hoarse but steady, seizing the opening someone had carved out of thin air. Shift fire north, keep their heads down. His men responded with everything they had left. Discipline layered onto desperation. Even wounded, they fought like men who refused to die quietly. Alexis kept moving. She engaged the second machine gun position, the gunner barely having time to swing the weapon before she ended him. Another fighter tried to take his place. He didn't finish kneeling. Suppressive shots followed, placed not to kill, but to pin, to break will. She knew when lethal force was necessary and when fear would do the job just as well. Time compressed. Minutes felt like seconds. Seconds stretched long enough to make choices matter. She fired again and again, each shot a decision that could not be undone. She did not feel powerful. She felt responsible. Every miss would cost lives below. Every hit ended one above. There was no clean way through that math. By the time the last fighter broke and ran, the ambush was already dead. Alexis tracked the runners, deciding who could escape and who could not. She chose restraint when it mattered, precision when it didn't. When the hills finally went still, she stayed on scope, scanning for movement long after the firing stopped. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. 19 rounds. The number settled into her mind without ceremony. She lowered the rifle slowly, her hands steady but heavy. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving behind a hollow ache that spread through her chest. Below, she could see the Rangers moving now, helping the wounded, securing their dead. Two black shapes stood out against the earth. She felt them like a weight. Too late for those two. That truth hurt more than anything else. She powered down the scope and sat back against the rock, suddenly aware of how alone she was. No radio chatter, no confirmation, no one telling her she'd done the right thing. The silence pressed in, thick and absolute. This was the part no one talked about. The space after action, when the noise was gone and only consequences remained. She thought about Briggs then, about his voice cutting her off, about the threat of court-martial still hanging in the air like a storm she'd already stepped into. She thought about her mother, about the look she'd had when the chaplain came to the door, about how that look might return, reshaped by different words. Alexis closed her eyes briefly. She didn't regret the choice, but she felt its weight. The helicopter rotors reached her before the aircraft did, a distant thrum that rolled across the valley. She watched from her perch as medevac birds dropped in, late but necessary. Men were lifted, carried, loaded. Lives continued because she had acted. That would have to be enough. When she finally stood, her legs protested, stiff from hours of stillness and minutes of violence. She slung the rifle carefully, treating it with the same respect she always had. It had done exactly what it was built to do. So had she. The walk back felt longer than the climb up. Each step carried her closer to judgment. She replayed the moment she'd turned off the radio again and again, testing it for doubt. None came. At base, the reactions were muted. Eyes followed her. Conversations paused. She was escorted, confined, processed with bureaucratic efficiency. Her weapon was taken, her comms removed, her name written into reports that would never tell the whole story. She sat alone in her quarters as the sun dropped behind the mountains, painting the sky in indifferent color. Somewhere, 10 Rangers were alive. Somewhere else, 2 families were beginning the worst days of their lives. Alexis sat on the edge of her bunk and finally let herself feel it. Not pride. Not fear. Grief. Grief for the lives she had taken, for the ones she hadn't reached in time, for the version of herself that had believed obedience and goodness were always aligned. A knock came at the door later, then another. The world was already moving toward her. She didn't know yet that someone had recorded everything, that voices she'd never met were speaking her name with gratitude, that the silence meant to erase her was already cracking. All she knew was this. When the moment came, she had acted. And whatever followed would have to reckon with that. What happens after the noise fades, when survival turns into paperwork and courage becomes a liability? Alexis Brennan learned quickly that silence could be louder than gunfire. The room they placed her in was small, functional, stripped of anything personal. A bunk, a metal desk, a chair bolted to the floor. No windows, no clock. Time became abstract, measured only by the change in guards and the distant hum of activity she was no longer part of. Her rifle was gone, her radio gone. Even her watch had been taken, as if knowing the hour might somehow help her defend herself. She sat with her hands folded, posture straight, the way she'd been taught. Stillness had always been her ally, but this kind of stillness was different. It wasn't tactical. It was imposed. No one spoke to her that first night. She replayed the valley again and again, not as a film but as fragments. The machine gun, the hesitation, the moment she turned off the radio. She searched herself for regret and found none, only sadness. A quiet, steady grief that didn't shake her but weighed her down. Morning came without announcement. A tray slid through the slot in the door. Food untouched by appetite. She ate anyway. Discipline didn't require hunger. Later, two officers entered. Neither met her eyes at first. One read from a tablet. Unauthorized engagement. Breach of command authority. Disregard for operational hierarchy. The words sounded sterile, as if describing equipment failure instead of human decision. Alexis listened without interruption. When asked if she had anything to add, she said only, "I stand by my actions." That was written down too. They left her alone again. Across the base, a different silence was forming. Staff Sergeant Kane sat on the tailgate of a transport vehicle, a bandage darkening his sleeve, staring at the ground like it might explain something. He kept seeing the moment the fire stopped. The impossible precision. The way death had retreated just enough to let them breathe. He fought long enough to know the difference between luck and intervention. Someone had saved them. In the medical tent, the men talked in low voices, compared angles, timelines, shots they hadn't heard, only felt in their bones. It didn't take long for a name to surface, not officially, not in reports, but in memory. Brennan. The name carried weight for some of them. For one man in particular, it carried a debt. Senior Chief Warren Briggs stood alone in his office long after the debriefings ended. The photograph lay face down on his desk. He hadn't meant for it to be found. It had been a mistake, sent in a moment of weakness he'd buried under years of authority and control. Nathan Brennan had saved his life once. A long-range shot, impossible conditions, enemy closing fast. Briggs had been young then, reckless, alive because someone else had decided he mattered more than orders. That knowledge had followed him into every rank, every command. It had shaped him in ways he rarely examined. When Alexis had walked into his briefing room weeks ago, wearing her father's name like a quiet challenge, something in him had panicked. Not because she was unqualified, but because she was proof. Proof that the choice he'd survived wasn't unique. That disobedience could be moral, necessary. And that terrified him. So he'd protected her the only way he knew how, by sidelining her, by keeping her out of danger, by making sure she never faced the kind of decision her father had. He told himself it was kindness. Now 10 Rangers were alive because she'd faced it anyway. Briggs closed the door and sat heavily, the years catching up with him all at once. Back in confinement, Alexis stared at the wall as footsteps approached. This time the knock came before the door opened. Kane stepped inside, moving carefully, pain etched into the lines around his eyes. He stood at attention out of habit, then seemed to remember himself. "I shouldn't be here," he said. She met his gaze calmly. "Then you should leave." He didn't. "They told us to write statements," he continued. "Official ones, clean, but that's not what happened." Alexis said nothing. "We were dead," Kane said quietly. "All of us. We just didn't know it yet." Something shifted in her chest. Not relief, not pride. Validation felt complicated now. He swallowed. "I told them the truth." After he left, the silence felt different, less oppressive, like a door cracked open somewhere down the hall. The investigation grew teeth. Audio logs surfaced, helmet cams, drone footage that hadn't been reviewed carefully the first time. Analysts slowed down frames, counted seconds, mapped trajectories. The picture that emerged was undeniable. An ambush neutralized from an unauthorized position. Precision beyond coincidence. One sniper. Sorry. The command climate shifted from punitive to cautious. then to defensive. Alexis was brought before a panel, faces she didn't know, ranks that didn't impress her. They asked why she disobeyed orders. She answered simply, because the orders were wrong, because men were going to die, because silence would have been easier. One man asked if she understood the precedent she was setting. She met his eyes. My father understood it. The room went still. Briggs testified last. He looked older than she remembered, smaller somehow. He spoke of Desert Storm, of a sniper who'd stayed behind, of a life spared, of guilt that turned into control, of fear disguised as leadership. His voice broke when he said her name. I failed her, he said, not because she disobeyed, but because I didn't trust her to be who she already was. The decision took days. Alexis waited. When it came, it wasn't triumphant. Charges dismissed. Commendation approved. Language carefully chosen to preserve structure without denying reality. She was cleared, but not celebrated. She didn't need celebration. She walked out into the sunlight feeling lighter than she had in months, not vindicated, understood. That night, alone again, she stood outside the wire and looked toward the hills. Somewhere out there was the ridge she'd chosen, the moment she'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She touched the photograph in her pocket. For the first time, the legacy didn't feel like a shadow. It felt like a bridge. And she was finally standing on the other side. What do you do with redemption when it finally arrives, quietly, without applause? Alexis Brennan did not feel changed in the way people expect after judgment passes. There was no surge of triumph when the charges were dismissed, no sense of victory when the door opened and no guard followed her out. What she felt instead was an unfamiliar lightness, like setting down a pack she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten its weight. The world looked the same. The bass sounded the same, and yet something fundamental had shifted. People met her eyes now. Not all of them, not comfortably, but enough. She returned to duty without ceremony. No speeches, no handshake in front of a flag. The commendation existed on paper, filed where it could neither be ignored nor praised too loudly. The system had found a way to acknowledge her without letting her become a symbol. That was fine with her. Symbols were heavy things. They attracted expectations she wasn't sure anyone should carry. She was assigned back to Overwatch. Not the edge this time. A real position, central, trusted. The first briefing after her return was almost ordinary. Almost. She took her seat, listening more than she spoke, absorbing the familiar rhythm of mission planning. When she did speak, the room paused, not in dismissal but in consideration. That pause mattered more than any medal. Still, sleep came slowly. At night the valley returned. The shots replayed not as guilt but as gravity. Each decision still existed inside her, complete and intact. She didn't try to erase them. She didn't try to justify them either. She simply carried them the way all snipers do, carefully, silently, aware of their weight. She visited the memorial one evening alone. 2 new names had been etched since her last deployment. She stood before them, reading each letter like it might speak back. She thought about how close those names had come to being 10 more, how thin the line had been. She rested her palm against the cold stone and allowed herself a moment of grief unobserved. Not today, she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was speaking to. Behind the scenes, the ripple continued. Training protocols were revised, not officially because of her, but because patterns had been noticed. Communication chains clarified, dismissals examined, quiet acknowledgments that sometimes danger wore the mask of normalcy. Alexis didn't attend those meetings. She didn't need to. Change didn't require her presence anymore. That, too, felt like a kind of redemption. Briggs requested to speak with her weeks later. They met in a neutral space. No rank on the table between them, just 2 chairs. 2 people shaped by the same moment decades apart. He didn't apologize immediately. He talked instead about fear. about leadership mistakes made in the name of protection, about how saving someone once could turn into a lifetime of trying to control the outcome. "I thought if I kept you away from danger," he said quietly, "I could keep him alive too." Alexis listened without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded once. "He already was," she said. That was all. He stood, offered his hand. She shook it. The past didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. Her next mission came sooner than expected. Different terrain, different country, same quiet anticipation. She lay in position as dusk settled, the sky bleeding color slowly, beautifully. Her spotter murmured wind adjustments, his voice steady and trusting. She confirmed without hesitation. This time, no one questioned her assessments. That trust brought its own pressure. Being heard meant being accountable in a new way. There was nowhere to hide now, not behind dismissal, not behind anonymity. She felt the weight of that too and accepted it. The target never came. Hours passed, then more. Eventually the call was made, stand down, false alarm. Everyone returned safely. No shots fired, no decisions that would echo for years. Alexis felt relief wash through her, unexpected and profound. Sometimes doing nothing was the hardest outcome of all. On her way back, she paused on the ridge and looked out over the land. She thought about how many times silence had almost cost lives, and how, this time, it hadn't. Because someone had listened, because she had been trusted to see clearly. She thought of her father then, not as a ghost, not as a story, but as a man who'd made a choice in a moment much like hers. She understood him better now, not just the act but the aftermath. The way such choices followed you, reshaped you, asked to be carried with dignity rather than pride. That night, she wrote a letter she would never send. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't an explanation. It was a promise to remain steady, to speak when necessary, to act when silence would be easier, to never confuse obedience with integrity again. When she folded the paper, she didn't feel finished. She felt aligned. Redemption, she realized, wasn't about erasing the past or being forgiven by systems or superiors. It was about learning to live honestly with the choices that defined you and letting them sharpen, not harden, who you became next. Outside, the base settled into its familiar rhythm. Lights dimmed, voices faded. Somewhere, a helicopter lifted off into the dark. Alexis lay back and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring another ridge, another watch, another moment where clarity might be demanded. And when it came, she would be ready, not because she wanted to prove anything, but because she finally trusted herself enough to act. Quietly, precisely, without needing to be seen. When the smoke finally clears, who are you allowed to become? Alexis Brennan stood alone at the edge of the flight line as dawn stretched thin light across the horizon. The air smelled of fuel and dust, familiar and grounding. Helicopters rested in their bays like animals between hunts. Somewhere behind her, the base was waking, boots on concrete, distant laughter, the low murmur of routine returning. Life continuing as it always did. She breathed it in slowly. The last mission hadn't made headlines. No briefings referenced her name. No after-action reports singled her out. That was how she preferred it. The world didn't need another story polished into something easy to consume. What mattered was quieter, harder to see. Trust. It showed up in small ways now. A nod in the hallway, a question asked without condescension, a pause in a briefing where her words weren't just heard but weighed. She hadn't demanded any of it. She hadn't chased it. It had grown naturally, the way credibility always did, through consistency, not noise. She was packing her kit when Kane approached, moving more carefully than before but with the same steady presence. They didn't talk about the valley anymore. They didn't need to. Some experiences lived better in silence. He handed her a folded piece of paper without explanation. She opened it later, alone. 10 signatures, 10 names. Beneath them, a simple line written in uneven ink, "Because you were there." She folded the paper and placed it inside her journal, closing the cover gently. Gratitude, she'd learned, carried responsibility too. It asked you to live in a way that honored it, not loudly but honestly. Her final debrief before rotation was brief. "You good to go?" the commander asked. "Yes, sir." No qualifiers, no caveats. She walked out into the sun feeling something she hadn't expected: peace. Not relief, not pride. Peace came from alignment, from knowing that who you were on paper and who you were under pressure no longer contradicted each other. Later, on a quiet ridge far from any conflict zone, Alexis stopped during a training exercise and looked out across the land. The terrain was benign, green, open, nothing like the valley that had changed her, and yet she felt the same stillness settle over her, the same awareness sharpen her senses. She thought about the girl she'd been once, the child clutching a folded flag she didn't understand, the cadet desperate to be perfect, the operator who had believed silence was safety. She didn't reject those versions of herself. She thanked them. They had carried her here. Her radio crackled with a routine check-in. She answered calmly, voice steady, no tension beneath the words. Nothing to prove, nothing to hide. As the exercise ended, she packed up slowly, deliberately, savoring the ordinariness of it. This quiet competence was what she had fought for, not recognition, not absolution, the right to do her job with integrity intact. That evening she sat outside her quarters as the sky deepened to indigo. She wrote again, not in letters this time, but in fragments, thoughts, observations, small truths earned the hard way. That courage often looked like restraint. That leadership listened as much as it commanded. That dignity didn't announce itself. She closed the journal and leaned back, watching the first stars appear. Somewhere, far beyond this place, other women were stepping into rooms where they would be underestimated. Other soldiers were facing moments where orders and ethics might collide. She hoped quietly that the path would be a little clearer for them now. Not because of her name, but because of her choice. When she finally stood, she felt the weight she carried had settled into something manageable. Not lighter, just balanced. She knew there would be other hard moments ahead, other decisions that would ask something from her she wasn't sure she had yet. But she also knew this. When the moment came, she would not disappear into the background. She would not wait to be validated. She would act with care, with resolve, with humanity. Because sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes resilience doesn't demand recognition. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.